In the winter of 1864, vigilantes stormed the cabin of Montana Territory's most trusted lawman and uncovered a nightmare that would scar the frontier forever. Sheriff Henry Plummer. The man sworn to protect Bannock City had secretly orchestrated the murders of travelers and townsfolk for more than 3 years. Beneath the floorboards, they found maps charting gold shipments, personal belongings of the missing, and a leather-bound ledger listing 102 victims. What followed revealed a vast criminal network so deeply rooted it had infiltrated the territorial government itself, twisting law and order into a weapon of fear. Before we continue with Plummer's reign of terror, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more stories like this. And in the comments, tell me where you're listening from. I love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts across America. The full truth about Sheriff Plummer would not surface until decades later, hidden in territorial records authorities had tried to bury. Bannock City, 1862. The town rose almost overnight after prospector John White struck gold along Grasshopper Creek that July. Within months, Wilderness became a booming mining camp of nearly 4,000 people. Their dreams built on crude cabins, canvas tents, muddy streets, and crowded saloons. Washington's distant government struggled to impose order, leaving local lawmen as the only real authority. Yet decent men avoided the badge, too busy with their claims or families, while drifters, ex-soldiers, and men with checkered pasts eagerly stepped in. Among them was Henry Plummer, a tall, lean 31-year-old who stood out from the rough miners with his polished manner, clean clothes, and air of authority. He spoke of lawman experience in California and Nevada, though he offered few details. The merchants and miners, desperate for order, welcomed him. When the new Bannock district needed a sheriff, his name rose to the top, endorsed by respected citizens, impressed by his calm demeanor. What they didn't know was that Plummer's history in California was marred with arrests for assault and suspicion of murder, and his sudden departure followed the mysterious death of a rival suitor. But in isolated Montana, such truths were impossible to confirm. The gold strikes created a dangerous mix of opportunity and vulnerability as miners carrying fortunes made perilous journeys to Salt Lake City and beyond. And in that chaos, Sheriff Plummer saw his chance to turn law enforcement into a mask for murder. In 1862, miners leaving Bannock carried their wealth in leather pouches and saddlebags, following narrow trails that wound through river valleys and mountain passes. These routes were predictable and easy to ambush, leaving travelers exposed as they crossed hundreds of miles of unforgiving wilderness. As winter set in, the dangers of Montana's cold were no longer the only fear. Disappearances along the Salt Lake City road had become too frequent to dismiss. At first, people blamed wild animals, brutal weather, or conflict with native tribes. But soon, even seasoned, well-armed men who had safely traveled those paths before were vanishing without a trace. Bannock's saloons filled with anxious whispers. Fortune seekers who had struck it rich were afraid to leave with their gold, yet staying meant watching their wealth shrink as supplies grew scarce and prices soared. The territorial government promised more patrols, but soldiers fared no better than civilians vanishing just as mysteriously. Amid this climate of fear, Henry Plummer presented himself as the solution. Speaking with authority, he insisted the region needed law enforcement rooted in local knowledge. He proposed citizen patrols and way stations along major routes, and his polished vision impressed both townspeople and officials. By the end of 1862, Henry Plummer was sworn in as sheriff of Bannock District, responsible for a vast swath of remote, dangerous frontier. The town celebrated, believing their security had finally been restored. Plummer quickly began recruiting deputies, hand-picking men he claimed shared his commitment to order. Among the first were Buck Stinson, a former soldier boasting survival skills, and Ned Ray, a quiet sharpshooter with a reputation for steady aim. What no one realized was that Plummer had just gained full authority over the very land where travelers were disappearing. The first chilling sign came only weeks later. In January 1863, Thomas Caldwell, a well-known merchant from Virginia City, prepared to haul nearly $8,000 in gold dust to Salt Lake City. Careful by nature, Caldwell never traveled alone and always informed Sheriff Plummer of his plans, believing it added a layer of protection. On January 15th, Caldwell visited Plummer's office where the sheriff's log recorded their conversation in detail. Caldwell outlined his northern route along the Beaverhead River with 2 armed guards at his side and said he expected to reach the first way station by nightfall. Plummer wished him luck and promised to send a deputy to check the trail if no word came within a week. Caldwell never arrived. His guards never returned. And Bannock began to suspect that something far darker than chance or misfortune was at work. When Deputy Buck Stinson led a search party a week later, the trail began as expected. They found ashes from a campfire horse dropping, scraps of food, all clear signs that Caldwell and his men had passed through. But 30 miles from Bannock, the trail abruptly ended. It was as if 3 men and their horses had been swallowed by the wilderness. Volunteers searched tirelessly, combing ravines and creek beds, until they stumbled upon a shallow grave hidden in a grove of pines. Inside lay the bodies of Caldwell and his 2 guards, each executed with a single shot to the back of the head. Their weapons, horses, and gold were gone. But it wasn't just theft that unsettled the searchers. The killers had stripped the bodies of clothing, boots, and personal belongings, and crude symbols had been carved into nearby trees' markings that suggested ritual or organization rather than random violence. Sheriff Plummer arrived swiftly, displaying the calm diligence of a seasoned lawman. He studied the scene with careful precision, took extensive notes, and directed his deputies in widening the search. His words reassured the shaken townsfolk. He promised that justice would be served and no effort spared. Yet few noticed how subtly he steered the investigation away from certain areas, or how quickly he dismissed evidence that might have led closer to the truth. Both Stinson and Ned Ray seemed uncannily skilled at predicting what the search would yield, guiding efforts with eerie accuracy. The discovery sent Bannock into a panic. If 3 armed men could be executed so methodically, what chance did anyone else have on the trails? This was no act of desperate bandits. It was the work of an organized force with knowledge of routes, timing, and movements. To address the rising fear, Sheriff Plummer convened a meeting at the Methodist Church, the only hall big enough for the entire town. Standing before the anxious crowd, he painted a grim picture: the vast, unguarded territory, the killer's discipline, and the near impossibility of constant protection. But he balanced dread with resolve. He proposed expanding his deputy force, recruiting informants, and encouraging merchants to travel in larger, armed groups. He urged full cooperation between townspeople and law enforcement. Every suspicion, every stranger, every detail reported. The people left the church relieved, believing their sheriff was firmly in control. What they did not realize was that Henry Plummer was in control, but not for their safety. Every move he made was calculated to tighten the grip of his hidden criminal empire, ensuring it operated more smoothly, more ruthlessly, and with less chance of discovery. As the winter of 1863 dragged on, disappearances became so common that even the most skeptical began to see a pattern. The victims were never random. They were men known to carry gold, and nearly every one of them had informed Sheriff Plummer or his deputies of their travel plans before vanishing. By spring, Bannock was no longer the thriving gold camp it had once been, but a town gripped by fear. What had started as scattered highway robberies had evolved into a coordinated campaign of murder and theft. Letters poured into Washington, pleading for federal protection, while the camps themselves began to collapse under the weight of uncertainty. Wealthy miners were afraid to leave, which created a scarcity of circulating currency. Prices for basic goods soared. Some men melted their gold into crude bars and buried them in secret caches. Others abandoned their claims entirely, fleeing to safer ground rather than risk death on the trails. Meanwhile, Sheriff Plummer seemed tireless. He rode long hours, investigated every report, and impressed visiting officials with his relentless pursuit of justice. To the outside world, he was a lawman under siege. In truth, his investigations were carefully crafted reconnaissance missions, gathering intelligence on shipment schedules and personal habits of wealthy miners. His informants were not loyal citizens, but criminals feeding him targets. Plummer's brilliance lay in how seamlessly his authority cloaked his crimes. As sheriff, he had every right to question travelers, requisition supplies, deputize new men, and coordinate with other agencies. He investigated the very crimes he orchestrated, steering suspicion away and destroying evidence. But success bred weakness. By summer, the gang had grown too large to manage. What began as a small disciplined ring swelled into a sprawling network of dozens spread across hundreds of miles. Communication broke down, discipline slipped, and mistakes began to pile up. The first crack appeared in July 1863, when a trader named James Roma staggered into Virginia City, wounded but alive. Roma told a chilling story. He and two companions had been ambushed near Beaverhead Rock. His companions were killed instantly, but he had survived a gunshot to the shoulder by tumbling into a creek bed hidden as the killers searched for survivors. Unlike other attacks, Roma recognized one of the assailants, George Ives, a known associate of Sheriff Plummer, and one of his most trusted informants. Even worse, Roma overheard snatches of conversation that hinted at a wider organized network behind the killings. News of Roma's testimony spread like wildfire, and Plummer moved swiftly to control the narrative. He personally interviewed Roma, expressed public outrage, and promised to bring Ives to justice. He even issued a warrant and launched a territory-wide manhunt, which soon became the talk of every mining camp. But Plummer's real goal wasn't justice. It was silence. George Ives had broken the most important rule he had left a witness alive. A captured Ives posed a mortal danger to the entire enterprise. The manhunt was genuine, but its purpose was to find him before anyone else could, and to make sure he never lived to tell what he knew. For 3 long months, George Ives stayed one step ahead of capture, slipping through Montana's rugged wilderness with the help of safe houses and sympathizers. His ability to evade pursuit in such a sparsely populated land raised troubling questions. How could a known outlaw move so freely? Why did official searches always seem to come up short? As suspicions mounted, merchants and miners began comparing their dealings with Sheriff Plummer and his men. Slowly, patterns emerged: the sheriff's uncanny interest in travelers' plans, the convenient absence of his deputies during attacks, the total lack of progress despite his public displays of dedication. By October 1863, Virginia City had reached its breaking point. A group of prominent businessmen led by merchant William Palmer decided they could no longer rely on corrupt law enforcement. They quietly organized a committee of vigilance, a body of citizens determined to investigate and deliver justice where official channels had failed. Vigilance committees were not unusual on the frontier, but what set Virginia cities apart was its leadership. These were not mobs acting in rage. They were educated, respected men who valued evidence and careful process even outside the law. Their biggest advantage was secrecy. They already suspected Plummer, and unlike frightened townsfolk, they never brought their findings to him. Instead, they worked quietly, re-interviewing survivors like James Roma, without the sheriff's knowledge, cross-checking accounts of robberies, and searching for signs of inside coordination. The picture that emerged was chilling. This was no case of a negligent sheriff or a few rogue bandits. It was something far more sinister. The investigation gained momentum in November 1863, when committee member John Bozeman captured Red Yeager, a close associate of George Ives. Instead of handing him over to Plummer's office, the committee held him in secret. Their interrogation was relentless and precise, yielding the confession that changed everything. Yeager revealed that the robberies were not random at all, but part of a disciplined criminal organization of more than 30 men operating across 3 districts. They had a name, the Innocents, and they were bound together by military-style codes, signals, and strict hierarchy. At the very top, Yeager confessed, stood Sheriff Henry Plummer himself. Even more horrifying, the gang's headquarters was not hidden deep in the wilderness. It was beneath Bannock's sheriff's office. Yeager described the gang's inner workings in detail. Coded messages passed along the trails, signal fires lit from ridgelines, maps charting every gold route with ambush points carefully marked, and a roster of local citizens secretly enlisted into the fold, including several of Plummer's official deputies. The Vigilance Committee now faced an impossible dilemma. They had uncovered evidence not of common banditry, but of a criminal empire that had corrupted the very institution meant to protect them. To move against Plummer was to declare war not only on their sheriff, but on the very system of law and order that gave the territory its fragile stability. What the Vigilance Committee had uncovered was nothing less than organized terror carried out by the very men entrusted with law and order. This was not corruption at the edges of government. It was a system of murder, theft, and intimidation directed at an entire population sanctioned by the sheriff's badge. Legal recourse was impossible. The system itself had been poisoned. Wilbur Sanders, trained in law, urged caution. He argued for patience, gather more evidence, identify every member, and move with precision to prevent innocent bloodshed in the inevitable backlash. But William Palmer and the businessmen pressed for speed. Every day that Plummer remained sheriff meant more killings and greater risk that the conspiracy would discover their investigation. While the committee wrestled with strategy, events overtook them. George Ives, the outlaw whose capture Plummer dreaded, had finally been cornered near the Stinking Water River. Unlike so many before him, he was taken alive and, crucially, by a mixed posse of deputies and volunteers beyond the sheriff's control. News of Ives' capture spread fast. Plummer rushed to assert authority, dispatching trusted deputies to seize custody and return him to Bannock. But the citizens of Nevada City had grown wary of the sheriff's endless failures. They refused to hand Ives over, determined to keep him where Plummer could not silence him. The standoff drew miners and merchants from across the territory. Within days, Nevada City was transformed into an impromptu convention of frontier justice, as citizens compared notes for the first time outside Plummer's supervision. What they shared was damning. Nearly identical accounts of Plummer's probing interest in gold shipments, his deputies' suspicious absences during attacks, his performative investigations that yielded nothing. One blacksmith revealed he had forged special horseshoes for the sheriff, designed to leave misleading tracks. A supply merchant testified to unusual orders for ammunition and food, never entered into official records. A telegraph operator admitted he had been told to delay or misdirect messages tied to ongoing investigations. With each revelation, the gathering shifted from a prisoner transfer into a full-scale tribunal. Ives stood accused not only of robbery and murder, but of representing the vast conspiracy itself. Under relentless questioning, he began to break. His answers confirmed and expanded Red Yeager's earlier confession. The Innocents were no loose band of outlaws. They were a disciplined syndicate of more than 30 men, responsible for at least 100 murders in just 2 years. They preyed on miners, merchants, and travelers with inside information gathered through Plummer's official authority. Most chilling of all was Ives's description of the sheriff himself. Plummer was no passive figure skimming bribes. He was an active killer. He had personally led ambushes, used his badge to disarm victims, and lured men into traps with cold precision. Among his gang, his reputation was one of ruthless efficiency, a man who could murder without hesitation. These revelations electrified the crowd. The illusion of Bannock's protector shattered, replaced by the horrifying realization that the territory's lawman was its chief predator. But this knowledge created a new urgent problem. Now that the truth was in the open, the people had to decide whether they were ready to confront Henry Plummer directly and risk war with the most dangerous criminal organization in the American West. By the end of 1863, Montana Territory stood on the edge of open war. The interrogation of George Ives had shattered any illusions about law and order, exposing a vast criminal conspiracy directed not by bandits in the hills, but by Sheriff Henry Plummer himself. Everyone knew the innocents would retaliate, and the only question was, how violently? The Vigilance Committee had overwhelming evidence, but they were isolated, cut off from federal authority hundreds of miles away. Local officials were either powerless or corrupted, and Plummer still commanded dozens of armed men. With their sheriff unmasked and desperate, the citizens faced a choice between justice and survival. The trial of George Ives became the turning point. For hours, citizens argued about what to do. Some urged transporting Ives to Salt Lake City or even Washington, but the risks were enormous, moving him through territory controlled by his own allies with no guarantee of safety. Others insisted immediate action was the only way to protect the community. On the freezing night of December 19, 1863, the crowd reached a fateful decision. Ives would stand trial before a citizens' court, with Wilbur Sanders as prosecutor and Charles Bagg reluctantly serving as defense counsel. Through the bitter Montana cold, lanterns lit a courtroom of desperate men. Sanders presented the case with methodical precision. Months of testimony, Ives's own admissions, and corroborating details from Red Yeager and other captured associates. The evidence was overwhelming. Yet the urgency of the proceedings grew by the hour as riders brought news that Plummer and his men were mobilizing, marching toward Nevada City to rescue Ives, or kill those testifying against him. Charles Bagg pleaded that Ives had been coerced, that a proper trial required federal courts. But his words fell flat against the tide of evidence and fear. As dawn broke on December 21st, the verdict was delivered guilty on all counts. The sentence was death. Ives's execution was swift, carried out with a rope strung over a makeshift gallows. His final words warned that Plummer would never allow the citizens' rebellion to succeed. The hanging of George Ives marked a point of no return. For Montana's citizens, it was the first taste of victory against the criminal syndicate that had haunted them for years. For Plummer and his followers, it was an existential threat. He cast aside all pretense of being a lawman. The mask of legitimacy was gone. Plummer activated his full network, unleashing chaos across the territory. Farms were burned, mining camps raided, and suspected supporters of the Vigilance Committee hunted down. What began as whispers of corruption had escalated into outright civil war on the frontier, with Sheriff Henry Plummer now revealed as the architect of terror. By January 1864, Henry Plummer's reign of terror was collapsing. What had begun as a secret network of bandits, disguised under the authority of his badge, had now become an army of occupation terrorizing the territory in open defiance of its citizens. But after the trial and execution of George Ives, the people of Montana had crossed their own line of no return. They had proven that organized resistance was possible, and the veil covering Plummer's conspiracy had been torn away. Now, it was time for the final reckoning. The Vigilance Committee, led by Wilbur Sanders and William Palmer, devised a systematic plan to dismantle the Innocents. They divided Plummer's men into 3 categories: those who might be spared if they abandoned the gang, those too dangerous to live, and those who could be captured alive for trial. Their goal was not revenge, but the complete destruction of Plummer's criminal empire. The first strike came on January 10, 1864, when 20 armed vigilantes surrounded a cabin outside Bannock, where Buck Stinson, one of Plummer's most brutal deputies, was hiding. Inside, they found not only Stinson, but damning evidence maps of gold routes, coded symbols, marking ambush sites, financial ledgers, showing how the loot was divided, and letters tying Plummer to associates as far away as Utah. Most chilling of all was Plummer's personal journal. Written in his own careful hand, it revealed a man without conscience. He described victims as problems to be solved, relished the irony of investigating murders he had committed, and gloated over deceiving the very people who trusted him. The final entries showed a mind unraveling plans to silence witnesses, paranoid fears of betrayal, and a scheme to flee to Mexico with his fortune. Confronted with this evidence, Stinson did not resist. He confessed the structure of the gang and confirmed what many had long suspected: Henry Plummer was not only the leader, but the architect of the entire conspiracy. Shortly after, Ned Ray was seized at his home. More records uncovered there revealed the staggering scope of the crimes. Over 2 years, the Innocents had stolen the equivalent of $500,000 in gold and cash, the life savings of hundreds who had vanished on the trails. Only one man remained at large, Sheriff Henry Plummer himself. Capturing him would be the most dangerous task of all. Though exposed, he still carried the title of sheriff, and some officials might rally to his defense. He was armed, desperate, and cunning, a man more likely to die fighting than submit to justice. The manhunt that followed was unlike anything the territory had ever seen. More than 100 citizens scoured the land, cutting off escape routes, blocking mountain passes, and intercepting messages to his allies. For the first time, a search was led by men who understood his methods, his psychology, and his habits. They anticipated his every move. The end came on January 14, 1864, at a ranch house 20 miles south of Bannock. Plummer and a handful of loyal men had holed up, surrounded by an army of vigilantes. Realizing escape was impossible, Plummer tried to negotiate. He promised to reveal hidden treasure, name fugitives, and even disband his gang if he was given safe passage to Mexico. But the citizens had heard enough. Too many lives had been lost. Too much trust had been betrayed. No compromise could erase the blood he had spilled. The stage was set for the final justice of the frontier. Henry Plummer had long since forfeited any claim to mercy. His reign of calculated cruelty and deception had left too many graves across the Montana frontier. When the vigilantes finally closed in on him at the ranch house south of Bannock, the fight was brief and brutal. The gunfire lasted less than 10 minutes. Plummer and his last loyal followers fell where they stood. When his body was found, the once respected sheriff was clutching a pouch of stolen gold dust, the life savings of a murdered Virginia City merchant whose family had never known what became of him. The search of the ranch house revealed horrors more haunting than the gunfight itself. Hidden away were the personal effects of dozens of missing men, wedding rings, photographs, letters from home possessions of no real value, except to those who had lost them. For the searchers, many of whom had lost friends or relatives to the Innocents, it was a grim confirmation of what they had long suspected but could not prove. Plummer had not only killed for profit, he had reduced human lives to trophies cataloged in his private war against the very people who trusted him. The death of Henry Plummer and the dismantling of the Innocents ended the most organized criminal conspiracy in frontier history. In the weeks that followed, vigilantes across Montana hunted down remaining members, holding citizen trials and carrying out swift executions. By March 1864, the gang was gone, its members dead imprisoned or driven out of the territory. The effect was immediate and dramatic. For the first time in 2 years, merchants and miners traveled safely along the gold routes. Shipments moved regularly. The economy revived, and communities once paralyzed by fear began to prosper again. Yet the legacy of Plummer's crimes reached far beyond Montana. The revelation that a sitting sheriff had orchestrated more than 100 murders while maintaining the illusion of justice sent shockwaves across the West. It exposed the vulnerability of frontier towns to organized conspiracies and underscored how inadequate formal law enforcement was in territories where federal oversight barely existed. The Montana vigilantes who brought down Plummer became legendary, their actions shaping how frontier justice would be remembered and in some cases imitated for decades to come. But their methods raised troubling questions. Critics, even at the time, argued that citizen courts and hangings without formal appeals undermined constitutional protections and set a dangerous precedent. Supporters countered that in the face of corruption, so deep it reached territorial commissioners and federal appointees, extraordinary measures were not only justified, but necessary. Documents seized from Plummer's operation showed that bribery, intimidation, and negligence had compromised officials far beyond his immediate gang. The sheriff had not acted in isolation. He had exploited a system already rotting at its core. The fall of Henry Plummer left Montana safer, but it also left America with a sobering reminder: when law itself is corrupted, citizens may be forced to choose between the risks of inaction and the dangers of justice delivered by their own hands. The people of Montana Territory had been abandoned by every level of official authority, leaving them no choice but to take justice into their own hands. Wilbur Sanders, who had prosecuted many of the vigilante trials, would later defend their actions before territorial and federal authorities. He insisted that the committee had acted with restraint, that the evidence was overwhelming the danger immediate, and that law enforcement had not only failed, but actively served criminal interests. The financial investigation that followed revealed the staggering scale of the innocents' crimes. Hidden caches of gold and currency were recovered across the territory, though they represented only a fraction of what had been stolen. Much of the wealth had already been spent or funneled to accomplices in other regions, leaving the families of victims with little chance of restitution. Yet the financial devastation paled beside the human toll. At least 102 confirmed victims were identified, though investigators believe the true number was far higher. Entire families had vanished, businesses collapsed, and entire communities had endured years of calculated terror. The scars left by Plummer's reign would haunt Montana for generations. His ability to maintain the image of a respected sheriff while orchestrating systematic murder revealed how deeply organized crime could infiltrate fragile frontier governments. Plummer's genius was not only in his violence, but in his manipulation of the law itself, using the power of his badge to disarm, deceive, and destroy. It was a chilling new model of American criminality. Federal authorities, alarmed by the scale of the conspiracy, launched their own investigation. Their report became a landmark in the history of American law enforcement, confirming the committee's findings and concluding that Henry Plummer and the innocents had been responsible for over 100 murders. The investigation vindicated the vigilantes' actions, acknowledging that citizen justice had been the only viable path in a territory where law itself had been hijacked. But the federal report also sounded a warning. It admitted that while the Montana vigilantes had acted under extraordinary circumstances, their example was dangerous. Citizen justice could all too easily descend into mob rule if unchecked. The destruction of the innocents showed both the power and the peril of frontier justice, a reminder that when law fails, the line between justice and vengeance becomes dangerously thin. The story of Henry Plummer and the innocents became legend across the American West. For some, it was a tale of courage of ordinary citizens standing up to terror when no one else would. For others, it was a chilling example of what happens when law itself collapses. Either way, it remains one of the most haunting reminders of the price communities pay when justice is left undefended. The Montana vigilantes were hailed as heroes who brought order when official authority had utterly failed. But they were also condemned by critics as dangerous men who set a precedent for mob rule over constitutional law. As Montana Territory grew into statehood with stronger institutions and professional law enforcement, the bloody events of 1863 and 1864 began to take on a mythical aura. The story of Sheriff Henry Plummer's double life as protector and predator was told and retold, often embellished in ways that made the truth seem even more dramatic. But for those who lived through those years, no exaggeration was needed. They had seen with their own eyes what happens when the very officials sworn to protect citizens instead prey upon them. They had experienced how easily criminals could manipulate the law, exploit isolation, and build empires of terror in the shadows of weak institutions. And they had learned at terrible cost that sometimes ordinary people must stand against evil when every other option is gone. The true legacy of Henry Plummer was not just written in the gallows or in the firefights that destroyed the innocents, but in the reforms that followed. The Montana territorial government established new layers of accountability, created more reliable communication with federal authorities, and implemented oversight measures designed to keep law enforcement from being corrupted again. These safeguards, born of blood and betrayal, became models for other frontier territories, ensuring that the nightmare of Bannock would not be repeated. Yet the story of Henry Plummer remains unsettling more than 150 years later. It forces us to ask hard questions about authority, justice, and the fragility of democratic institutions. The citizens of Montana in 1864 faced an impossible choice. Accept systematic terror at the hands of criminals who wore badges, or take the law into their own hands. That they chose vigilante justice and succeeded does not erase the danger of the precedent they set. Their story reminds us that the gravest threats to society often come not from outlaws hiding in the wilderness, but from those who hide behind the mask of legitimacy. Plummer's rise and fall shows just how vulnerable isolated communities can be to deception and organized crime, and how blurred the line can become between authority and corruption. It leaves us wondering, was the full extent of his conspiracy ever uncovered? Or were some secrets buried forever in the wilderness of Montana, taken to the grave by men who knew too much? What do you think? Was every piece of Henry Plummer's dark empire revealed? Or does part of his story remain hidden in the shadows of history? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories of hidden crimes and forgotten mysteries from America's past, don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves historical mysteries. Until next time.
Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.